Okay, so very weird experience my ex-girlfriend and I had back in '04 and '05 in rural Louisiana that's somewhat relevant. We were hanging out at her parents' house on a summer night, watching movies. Nothing out of the ordinary. We were around 16 or 17 at the time, so when 12:30 to 1 a.m. rolled around, it was time for me to head home. I didn't have a vehicle at this point, so she usually dropped me off. Keep in mind, this is a rural area in Louisiana, and we lived in the complete opposite sides of town. At this time of night, there were hardly any cars on the road, and it was rather spooky driving through the wooded areas to get to my place, which was secluded, to say the least. We're about halfway to our destination, and in mid-conversation, she stops talking and asks me if I've noticed the headlights that have been behind us for quite some time. I replied no, that I hadn't noticed, but I assured her there was nothing to worry about. We continued our conversation, but now I'm really paying attention to the headlights behind us, and I notice they're getting closer. To get to my house, there were a lot of turns down roads that weren't main roads, and these headlights were staying with us. At this point, panic starts to set in for both of us as we try to come up with like a worst-case scenario plan. I thought of just pulling into the first driveway, but then thought, what if no one's home? And would they even help at this time of night? Scratch that idea. I had an old flip phone at the time and decided the best course of action was to call my house phone and hope that my dad would answer. Between that point and us turning down my dead-end road, I probably called 8 to 10 times with no answer, with the headlights still following us at every turn. I told my girlfriend to just pull into my driveway and lay on the horn. We pulled in and do just that. The other vehicle pulls in right behind us. No one is coming out of my house, so she decides to cut across my front yard and try and get back on the road. I'm still calling. As we go to turn around, the other car cuts us off, and that's when I get a good look at the man. Probably 50 to 60 years old, large rimmed glasses, and smoking a cigarette. Our eyes meet, and he gave me the weirdest, creepiest grin, and that's when I had made my mind that I was going to have to get out and confront the man. Right as I was building up the courage to do so, my dad ran out of the front door, and the man in the car sped away. Needless to say, we didn't get very much sleep that night. She stayed at my place, and we reported the incident with the best description we could give, but to no avail. I was selling my old car as I had bought a new one. I posted it on a couple of selling sites and Facebook. I arranged 2 visits that day and was home alone. It was broad daylight, so I assumed everything would be fine. First one that came made me an offer a little lower than what I was looking for, so I said I would get back to him later as I had another viewing. The guy from Facebook pulled up in a blacked out Range Rover, and 3 other guys got out. I opened the car and explained why I was selling it. You know when you just get a bad feeling? I wasn't sure why 4 people would need to come view an 8-year-old car. He asked if he could take the car for a drive. At this point, I wasn't going to get in the car with him, so I said, yeah, take it. I shall wait here with your friends. He asked me to get in the car. What if he just took it? I said, well, it wouldn't matter. That's what insurance is for. I was not getting in the car with him. The 3 guys left, didn't speak to me, just to themselves, and I couldn't understand. But it made me feel very unsure if the car would come back. The car was not worth putting up a fight over. I was questioning my life choices when he pulled back up. He got out and offered the same as the other guy earlier, buying the car for his daughter. He wanted me to get into the car with him to go collect the cash. I said it was fine, his friends could take him if he needed to go, but I had another viewing, and I would contact him later. I didn't want to walk back to my house, as I had now decided to sell to the other guy, as they were just giving me the creeps. He then offered more than honestly the car was worth if I went with him now. I said no and locked the car and started to walk towards the main street, as I had seen my neighbor walking down and shouted to him and his dog. They spoke to each other and drove off. I texted the other guy and told him the car was his, and he was welcome to come over any time to get it. Sorted, filled out the V5, and off he went. That night, from my living room, the black Range Rover came back and parked outside. I live in a cul-de-sac, so I'm set back to where we had been. I told my husband, and he looked and said it was strange. Then my phone started blowing up. I politely said the car had gone and that I was sorry, but I couldn't help. The car drove off and then came back again about 30 minutes later. This happened about 3 times that night, and it was strange, but I thought nothing more of it, as the next few days, nothing happened. On the Friday, 4 days later, I finish work early, get back, and get the dog ready to go out. We were going to head straight to the park and run like the wind. As I got to the end of the cul-de-sac, the same car pulled up, and one of the guys jumped out and said hello. I held the leash tighter, and my dog was thoroughly unimpressed. She gave a bit of a grumble, and he asked if he could pet her. I said no, she's a guard dog and doesn't like to be touched, and went to walk on. He then grabbed my arm, and the dog latched onto his forearm. Cue his screaming. There was only one other guy with him in the car, and he jumped out and started to shout. This dog is the most placid and loving dog you've ever seen, and to be honest, it was a warning nip, as if she had really meant to hurt him, she would have gone through the bone. His friend was shouting and pulling him away. I called her back and got her to sit. A few neighbors came out, and they went towards the car. I haven't seen the car since, and honestly, I wouldn't sell something that meant someone had to come to my house online again. So stranger, who clearly wasn't interested in the car, let's never meet again. I was on vacation with my family when I was about 14. I was in the pool, which had a bar attached, and I was casually talking to this group of British people. I want to say it was all guys, but I think I remember a girl with them. I started drinking a bit with them. The legal drinking age was 18, but the people who I was drinking with gave me an extra wristband they had, because apparently they were leaving the resort that day and wanted to give it to someone. My parents didn't know about this, and neither of them knew I was drinking. They were clearly a lot older and kept putting drink after drink in my hand, and I was ecstatic because I was, well, getting drunk in a pool in Cancun and out of sight from my mother. They started to try and convince me that one of the guys in the group was 15 and that I should talk to him because he liked me. Even then, I knew he definitely wasn't 15, but he also wasn't as old as the others, who seemed to be in their late 30s. In hindsight, I'm thinking mid to late 20s. I was young and just thought they were joking around with me. They kept telling me he liked me and I should go hang out with him. I laughed it off the first time, but they kept suggesting. Keep in mind, this whole time, my dad was in the same pool talking to his friend, and he had his eyes on me for almost the whole time. My parents are very strict. He didn't know what I was drinking was alcohol, and the pool was big enough that you couldn't hear what was being said. At that point, I was totally wasted, and my first time actually getting seriously drunk. I don't even remember leaving the pool with this guy, trying to tell me he was 15, but apparently my dumbass did, because I remember thinking he was cute. The resort is huge, and I don't know how I don't remember walking through the whole thing and not remembering it. The next thing I remember is walking and approaching a bus stop that was a 10-minute walk from the resort. I know it was 10 minutes because my family and I often went to this bus stop to explore Cancun. He told me I had a nice body and asked me if I ever had sex. I just started laughing, and he sat on the bus bench and pulled me onto his lap. At this point, my world is spinning, so I don't protest, even though I remember thinking I wanted to be back at the pool. It was then that something beautiful happened. I threw up all over him. Remember, I'm on his lap at this point, so it was like right in his face and on his chest, and kept throwing up, like the Exorcist level projectile vomiting. He was extremely grossed out, and I don't remember what he said, but we ended up walking back to the resort, and I never saw him again. I remember feeling so embarrassed, which is ridiculous in hindsight. I wobbled back to the pool area covered in throw up, where my mom had called the police, and her and my dad were freaking out. My mom's piercing voice sobered me up a bit, because I remember these parts a lot clearer, even though they're still hazy. They saw how drunk I was, and demanded to know what happened, so I told them. Then they got furious. My mom was adamant on finding that guy or his friends who had all disappeared from the pool. I didn't really see what the big deal was back then and why she wanted to find them. To this day, I think about what would have happened if I hadn't thrown up like that and actually left with him. I was 5'2" and 14 years old, and he was at least a foot taller than me, and definitely not a minor. I remember when he was close to me, with no one around, and even in my extremely drunk state, I started to get a bit nervous. My parents took me back to our hotel room, and I spent hours in the bathtub just throwing up. My mom was furious, like completely livid. I wasn't too surprised at that, because she yelled at me over trivial things all the time. So was my dad, which surprised me because he was always so easygoing, and honestly probably would have been a bit amused at me being drunk, throwing up, not in a cruel way, but because I was learning a lesson about alcohol that we all eventually do. He actually straight up told me that at some point before this whole vacation. But now I know that his anger wasn't directed towards me. He was cursing about the guy. I was still throwing up in the bathtub, and they had both went into the kitchen area to talk away from me. But I could vaguely hear my dad cursing terribly while speaking to my mom in our native language, and I was actually scared. I couldn't quite focus on his voice because I was legitimately drifting in and out of consciousness at that point. But I remember getting less scared and more just sad because I felt like I had disappointed him. He never got mad like that towards me. But then again, I realized later he wasn't angry at me, and he wasn't angry at the drinking. He was angry at that scumbag. I remember wondering why they were making such a big deal. It was a few years later that I understood. Later that day, because this all happened at like 2 p.m, so I was at least cognizant by dinner time. I expected my mom to blow up at me over dinner when I was sober, as she usually does. But they were both kind of just quiet and staring at me and didn't leave my side. I can't imagine what they were going through, knowing about the danger I had been in hours before, staring at me like it was a miracle that I was there. I was young and stupid, but I would like to give my deep thanks and gratitude to beer for consistently annoying my stomach to the point of projectile vomiting.